Hello and welcome back to BOSH tutorial series. In this session, it's going to be the second part of the section where we talk about the structure of BOSH releases, where we introduce BOSH releases. In this section, we are going to talk specifically about a real-world scenario of a BOSH release. It's going to be the JMeter BOSH release. And we're gonna go through each, like the actual components. We will not go into too many details as it's just breaking the ice, but we'll go through each component and just try to explain it. Don't worry if at the end of this session things seems a bit vague, some of the components. Don't worry about it because we're gonna cover it in much more detail when we start our session about creating a BOSH release. Before we start, just let me introduce JMeter. If you're not familiar with JMeter, it's don't worry about it. It's just a stress test software that is under the Apache Foundation. You can use it to load test or stress test your web application, your database, etc. We will not go into the details what JMeter now. It's not necessary, but just think about it as a load test application that you can use. It's written in Java, and basically that's it. So let's go first to the actual structure of like what are those folders. So we can see that at the top we have JMeter BOSH folder. Then we have just a few folders in it. Let's first start with packages, and a small recap from previous session is we know that a BOSH release is constituted of two main things, which are the packages, which contain our software bits, and we have the other part, which is the jobs, which technically are the services that we're gonna run. Basically, they will run our packages, the software in our packages. So under the packages folder, we see like there's multiple folders in them, and one of them, let's say, is OpenJDK. If you're not familiar with Java, JDK is Java Development Kit. It contains the JVM, it contains the compiler, plus other stuff. And because JMeter is written in Java, we know that we need the JVM somehow to run it, also to compile it. We need the compiler to compile it, although we don't do it right in this release. So here we could just what we did is we created a folder and then we call it the OpenJDK, and that will be our OpenJDK package. So inside each package we see two files. There's a packaging file and then there's a spec file. So if we open the spec file, technically this is the metadata about your package. The format is YAML. If you're not familiar with YAML, it's a data serialization language. It's made to be human readable. It's similar to JSON. Actually, it's a superset of JSON. And if you're not familiar with it, don't worry too much about it. We're gonna just explain things as we go. So for example, here we have the name of the package is OpenJDK. We have the dependencies. This is an array. It's an empty array. That means that this package doesn't have any dependencies. And we remember that from the previous session that packages can have dependencies on other packages only. And those are compilation time dependencies. So for OpenJDK, there's no dependencies. So it's an empty array. And then the other section, the last section of the spec, of the metadata file of the actual OpenJDK package that we created, are the references to the binaries or files that this package uses. So in this scenario, we have a reference for OpenJDK Turbo. Let's not worry about where this is coming from yet. We're gonna cover it whenever we go through the blobs. So just think about it as a reference for now. So this is the metadata. It's called the spec. And then the other file in any package, it's called the packaging file. What is that? We call that the compilation. If you think about it, this will be the compilation script that will run whenever you compile this package. It's gonna compile at some point whenever you deploy. BOSH is gonna compile it. We'll cover that later, but for now, think about it that in a package you'll have a spec file, which is the metadata, and then you'll have a packaging script, which is a shell script to tell BOSH that BOSH will run, and then it's going to compile it. Now, it's worth to say here that whenever we say compile, let's not relate it to just, let's say, if we are trying to compile, let's say, some Java classes or etc. Think about it in a way that we are making it available for BOSH to run, whatever step. So we can see here, for example, that in OpenJDK, it referenced the tarball of OpenJDK. So in the packaging script, what we do is we untar it into this folder, and then all the contents of the untarred JDK, we will move it and copy it to this specific target. Still, we will not go into exactly like where is this environment variable coming from, why are we putting it here, but imagine that you can do, let's say, between line 2 and 5, you do whatever you want to do to make your software runnable or available or ready to be used, and then the result of that operation, you take it and then you copy it into this folder. In this scenario, we are just untarring the OpenJDK tarball, and then we're just sticking the contents in this path. And we'll talk about this path in details, where this thing run whenever we go through the session of creating a release. So this is the OpenJDK package. We can see there's multiple other packages. I'm gonna talk just about the JMeter for now. And let's say you have the spec, as usual, it's called JMeter. And now you can see that this JMeter package has a dependency, which is the OpenJDK package, which is this. That means it's a compilation time dependencies. It needs it whenever you compile it. Like whenever we use the package, whenever we run the packaging script of JMeter, the OpenJDK package will actually be available for us. And also here we can see that the files that the JMeter package is referencing, it's also a tarball somewhere, which is the actual Apache JMeter tarball, which contained the jar file plus other configurations. And then here in the packaging, we are also untarring the actual JMeter package, the tarball, and then we are also copying to this path, which is coming from this environment variable. So don't worry about too much about like where is this gonna run. It's gonna be covered later, but for now, let's think about the package. We have the metadata file, which the name, all the dependencies, and which are the compilation time dependencies, and the references for the files that this package uses. So this will cover the packages. Now let's go and check with the actual jobs. So the second component that we talked about in last session was the jobs, and we thought about it as the service that we're gonna end up running. Let's say a loose one-to-one mapping of a service. So don't worry about the naming, but it's a bit weird naming. That's my fault. But let's think about, let's say this is a service, let's say JMeter Storm, and we run JMeter in a specific mode, let's say. If you open the actual structure of the JMeter Storm job, we can see there's another folder, and then there's two files. There's spec and bonnet. So spec is the same. It's also a metadata, like a file that will tell us exactly what is this job and other configuration for it. For now, we will not go into too much details, but we're gonna cover, let's say, the name and just the name of the actual job, and we're gonna cover also the packages list here. So if we remember, when we talked about the jobs, we know that we mentioned that the jobs they can have dependencies, and those dependencies are packages, and those are runtime dependencies. That means whenever this job is going to run, those packages will be available for it. And it's worth to mention that the packages that will be available for it, they are the compiled version of the packages. So it's not the raw packages, it's the compiled version of them. So whenever we go and compile the packages, and later on if we need to go and run the job, the packages that the job is referencing will be the compiled version of those packages. So it's going to be the compiled version of OpenJDK, JMeter, etc. There's other sections here we will not cover, and it will be covered in details whenever we create a release. So this is the actual job, and then there's also multiple jobs. You can see there's JMeter Tornado and JMeter Stormworker. There's also jobs that they also depends on other packages. Let's say this also, the JMeter Tornado depends on 4 packages. Let's say this guy also depends. I say it depends on 2 packages. So it's up to the service which packages it needs to use to run. So this is a quick overview about the jobs. Now let's go maybe one by one of those folders. What do they actually mean? Don't worry about getting all the details if something became vague, but this is a good introduction, just like to break the ice. Blobs. If we remember here, whenever we went to the packages and then we saw that, let's say, OpenJDK package, it references a specific file, which is, let's say, a tarball. But where this file is residing, it's technically can be in 2 places. It could be in the blobs folder, which is in the same, under the same, which is a sibling of the packages. So under the blobs, you can see there's an OpenJDK folder, and then in the OpenJDK folder, there's a tarball here. And this is actually where the package is going to reference the blobs from. So we mentioned that a package can reference source code or any artifacts from 2 places. From the blobs, which this is an example. It can also reference them from the actual source. So there's a source folder, and where, let's say, you have another, just some maybe like gems or some Ruby files or maybe Java classes, whatever you want to put there, your source code. So the package can reference those. So technically, whenever in your package you say files and then you list them, BOSH it's gonna look for those artifacts in those 2 places. It's either in the blobs folder or in the source folder. So question is maybe just explanation, why do we have those 2? Like, why it needs to look in 2 places? Why not just 1? Let's think about it in this way. Let's say JMeter here, one of the packages, let's say the JDK, it needs the OpenJDK tarball, which could be like a couple of 100 megabyte. And because potentially this source code, you like this actually app JMeter BOSH release, you want to just push it into a version control system, let's say Git, somewhere, let's say on GitHub. You don't want sometimes to push large files. So let's say, imagine this one is not a few megabytes, a few 100 megabytes, maybe it's gigs. So you don't really need to push it into like your version control system. So what happened is you create this folder, not directly but through another mechanism, and you put the actual blobs here, and those will not be pushed to the actual version control system of the release, where whenever you push this code, it will be pushed to somewhere else that you define yourself, and that somewhere else could be an S3 bucket, and you define that S3 bucket, let's say here. So whenever, let's say, you create one of the configuration of a BOSH releases, you need to tell it where do you want to find the blobs, and you can see here that this is, let's say, the bucket name, the provider is S3, and all the other details. So if you have any large sized binaries and you don't want to put them in your version control system, so you'll end up putting them in the blobs, and then those will be somehow uploaded to your blob store, which is, let's say, here an S3 bucket, and we will get into more details of how to do that and what's the benefits of that. But let's say if you have some source code, let's say some Ruby files, some Java classes, or any other source code, and you want to push it to your version control system, you can still You can put it in the source folder and you can just continue using it, and it will be pushed to the version control system. And by the way, there's nothing preventing you from actually putting a binary or like a large file inside the source folder and pushing it to the version control system. It should still work, but it's for convenience and for practicality. You have those two; they are separated. So this will cover the blobs, and I just cover like just before actually I opened the config, and we mentioned that actually it contains, let's say, the blob store, where all the blob store information, where you can find those, where you can actually decide where you want to put those blobs. So this is actually one part of the configuration that you define in the config folder, and there's a final.yaml file. Other than that, you also, the final name of your release, you can also define it here. I will not cover the blobs here because it will go more into the details of creating a release. And the last thing maybe we're gonna cover is the git ignore. And you can see here, just the most interesting part is that you can see that we are ignoring in the git ignore the blobs folder. So it will, any blobs that you add there, it will not be pushed to your version control system by default. And the last, we didn't cover the releases. So think about now the releases is whenever you create a release, which we didn't talk about yet, but a BOSH release of a specific software can be versioned. So you can just start by 1 or whatever version you like and then go up. Those releases, the history, it's gonna be contained in this folder. So you can see, let's say you have an index and you have just some metadata information about it. You will not be creating it manually. It will be automatically be created whenever you create and version a release. So don't worry about writing those by hand. Hopefully that was a good overview. Hopefully it's not too quick about a real world example of a BOSH release. So just a quick recap. We saw that just a BOSH release, it's just a folder that contains subfolders. One of them is the packages, and the package contains some metadata information, which is the spec file, and also it contains a script to know how to compile that specific package. We also talked about the jobs, and each job also has a metadata file that has many things, but we cared about the name and the packages it reference. We also talked about the blobs and the source folder and why we separate them, and those are the artifacts that are being used by your packages that reference them. We also talked about the config, where we have, let's say, final.yaml, where you define where you are gonna store your blobs, in which blob store, and let's say here it's an S3. And we also talked about the releases, which is whenever you create a release, and in the BOSH terminology we call it whenever you finalize it. That means that you have a non-dev version of a specific of the release, and then it's gonna end up here, so that you can keep track of the versions of a BOSH release. I know this is too much information. Don't worry about it too much if it didn't make too much sense, all of it or part of it. We will go through much more details whenever we create a release. We're gonna go step by step of how to create a package, how to create a job, how to add a blob, what does it mean to add a blob, what does it mean to create a blob store to put the blobs in, what does it mean like whenever we are creating a packaging script, which is the compilation script of a package, like where is this environment variable coming from, where it's gonna run, this script, where it's gonna run. Those, all of them, they are gonna be covered in details whenever we go through creation of the release. But now, hopefully this was a good video to break the ice with a BOSH release of something and what is the structure for it. Thank you, and hopefully it was fun, and I'll see you in the next video.